He was slapped in a crowded cafe by a powerful female CEO, and no one knew the scar on his face would make her bodyguard freeze in silent recognition that changed everything in 1 second. Welcome to Poor Girl's Destiny. We wish you a wonderful day filled with happiness, peace, and positivity. Stay with us and enjoy this emotional story as we begin right now and follow every moment carefully as it unfolds. The cafe was filled with the soft clatter of cups, low conversations, and the warm smell of roasted coffee beans, until a sudden sharp silence cut through the room like a blade when Olivia Harrington, a powerful and well-known female CEO, stood up from her seat with cold precision and struck Daniel Carter across the face, the sound echoing louder than any voice in the room, freezing every customer in shock as phones lifted instinctively to capture the moment. Daniel did not fall, did not shout, and did not react in anger. Instead, he simply turned his head slightly, his expression controlled and unreadable, as if pain was not something that could easily reach him anymore, while a small child sitting quietly at a nearby table looked down in confusion, sensing something deeply wrong without fully understanding it. Olivia's eyes remained sharp, filled with authority and judgment, as she spoke in a low, firm voice, believing she had just dealt with a disrespectful stranger who had crossed a line in her presence, unaware that her action had just triggered something far more complicated than a simple confrontation. While the cafe manager hesitated behind the counter, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of a situation involving one of the most influential business figures in the city. Across the room, Marcus Blake, Olivia's bodyguard, had already shifted his stance the moment the slap landed, his trained instincts analyzing every detail of the man who had been struck, not focusing on the incident itself, but on Daniel Carter's reaction, or more precisely, his lack of one. Because something about his stillness did not match the profile of an ordinary civilian. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly as they landed on a faint scar partially visible near Daniel's jawline, subtle but precise, like something remembered rather than seen for the first time, and in that instant his entire expression changed from professional detachment to silent recognition of something buried deep in memory. Olivia adjusted her posture, expecting resistance, expecting words, expecting at least a reaction that would justify her certainty, but Daniel remained calm, his voice never rising, his body never moving toward aggression, only shifting slightly, as if to shield the emotional space of the moment rather than escalate it. And that calmness unsettled the room more than any retaliation could have. Whispers began to spread among the cafe customers, some shocked, some recording, some simply unable to process what they had just witnessed, while Marcus quietly took one step forward, his attention no longer on Olivia, but fully locked onto Daniel, as fragments of an old file he once saw in a classified briefing began resurfacing in his mind, tied to a similar mark, a similar scar, and a man who was never supposed to be easily identified in public life. Olivia finally spoke again, her tone firm, but slightly colder now as she demanded control over the situation. Yet the atmosphere had already shifted, because the real tension in the room was no longer about authority or humiliation, but about recognition, identity, and the unsettling possibility that the man she had just struck was not the person she believed him to be. While Daniel Carter simply stood there in silence, holding on to something far heavier than the moment itself, as the entire cafe unknowingly waited for a truth none of them were ready to hear. The cafe remained frozen in an uneasy silence after the slap, with customers still holding their phones mid-recording and the faint sound of coffee machines continuing in the background, as if the world itself was refusing to acknowledge the emotional weight of what had just happened. While Daniel Carter stood in the exact same position where he had been struck, his posture steady, his breathing controlled, and his expression unchanged, not because he was unaffected, but because he had long learned how to separate reaction from consequence. His eyes lowered briefly toward the table where the small child sat, still quiet and confused, and for a moment his attention softened in a way that no one else in the room seemed to notice, as if protecting that silence mattered more than responding to humiliation. Olivia Harrington remained standing, her presence still commanding, her business instincts interpreting the situation as resolved. Yet something about Daniel's lack of response was beginning to create an unfamiliar discomfort beneath her certainty. like a calculation that refused to balance correctly. Marcus Blake, however, had stopped thinking about the incident as a social confrontation entirely, his focus narrowing into something deeper as he studied Daniel's face, the angle of his jaw, and the faint scar that had triggered a buried memory he could not yet fully place. He did not move closer immediately, instead allowing his mind to run through fragmented recollections from past security briefings involving individuals whose identities were intentionally obscured, men whose records were incomplete not because they were unknown, but because they were protected. Ethan Brooks, the cafe manager, finally stepped forward slightly, unsure whether to intervene or maintain distance, his voice cautious as he attempted to restore normalcy by asking if everything was under control, but his words felt irrelevant against the tension that no longer belonged to the cafe itself but to the people inside it. Olivia turned slightly toward Marcus, expecting him to confirm that there was no issue, but instead she noticed his attention was fixed entirely on Daniel, his expression now serious in a way she had not seen before. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what is it?" He did not answer immediately, his eyes still locked on the scar, as if verifying a memory against reality, and when he finally spoke, his tone was controlled but noticeably different from before. "That mark," he said, "I have seen something like it before." The words shifted the atmosphere again, not loudly, but enough that even nearby customers sensed a change in energy without understanding why. Daniel remained silent, his posture still calm, but his awareness subtly shifted toward Marcus, acknowledging without reacting, as if he already knew that recognition was inevitable at some point. Olivia frowned slightly, her confidence beginning to fracture into curiosity. "Seen it where?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, the weight of professional boundaries visible in his pause, as though what he was about to recall belonged to a level of information not meant for public spaces or casual discussion. "In a restricted file," he finally said, "connected to an operation that was never publicly documented." That statement caused Olivia's expression to tighten, not with fear, but with reassessment, as she looked back at Daniel for the first time not as a stranger, but as a variable she could no longer classify. Daniel slowly raised his gaze, meeting Marcus's eyes briefly, and in that moment there was no hostility, no denial, only a quiet acceptance that recognition had begun. The cafe, still full of ordinary people, now felt like a place standing on the edge of something far larger than itself, as silence stretched longer than anyone expected, and the simple act of a slap had begun unfolding into something that none of them had fully understood yet. The cafe had now shifted from shock to a strange, uneasy stillness, as if everyone inside understood without being told that something deeper than a simple public confrontation was unfolding in front of them. While Olivia Harrington remained standing near the table, her posture still composed, but her expression no longer fully controlled. Because Marcus Blake's words had introduced a level of uncertainty she was not used to facing in public spaces, especially not in front of witnesses. Daniel Carter remained seated now, slowly lowering himself into the chair as if the moment no longer required him to stand, his movements calm and deliberate, with no sign of urgency or defensiveness, and that absence of reaction continued to disturb the balance in the room more than any emotional response could have. Marcus finally stepped closer to Olivia, lowering his voice slightly as he spoke again. "The scar is consistent with a restricted incident profile," he said carefully. Olivia turned her head toward him immediately. "Explain what that means in normal terms," she replied, her tone sharper now, but not dismissive. Marcus hesitated, as if choosing each word with precision. "It means that the injury pattern matches someone who was involved in classified operations that are not publicly documented." The words created a noticeable shift in Olivia's expression, not fear, but recalibration, as her mind began re-evaluating the man sitting only a few feet away from her. Daniel did not interrupt, did not defend himself, and did not offer clarification, which only made the situation feel more controlled and more unfamiliar at the same time. The cafe manager nervously attempted to resume normal service, asking if anyone would like anything, but his voice was ignored, swallowed by the heavier silence between the three main figures. Olivia finally turned back toward Daniel, her gaze now more measured than before. "If that is true," she said carefully, Then why would someone like you be sitting in a place like this? Daniel looked at her for a brief moment, his expression steady but not cold, then replied in a calm voice. Because places like this do not require explanations. The answer was simple, but it did not satisfy curiosity. Instead, it deepened it, because it suggested a level of restraint that did not align with ordinary civilian behavior. Marcus remained focused, now stepping fully into the space between assumption and certainty. I need confirmation, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, as if trying to align memory with reality. Olivia noticed the shift in Marcus's tone and narrowed her eyes slightly. You are not guessing, she said. You recognize something. Marcus did not deny it. Instead, he reached into his memory, recalling fragments of a briefing long buried in his professional past, where certain individuals were referenced only indirectly, their identities protected by classification layers that prevented even full access to names. The scar he had seen today matched one of those fragmented references, but he still could not connect all the missing pieces. Daniel slowly adjusted his position in the chair, placing his hands calmly on the table, not as a gesture of engagement, but of presence, as if allowing them time to arrive at their own conclusions without interference. Olivia studied him more closely now, her earlier authority replaced by analytical uncertainty. You are telling me you saw this before in a restricted file? She said to Marcus. Marcus nodded once. Yes. A pause followed, heavier than before, as the implications began forming without anyone needing to state them directly. Olivia looked back at Daniel again, her voice lowering slightly. Then who exactly are you? She asked. Daniel met her gaze for a moment, and in that silence there was no anger, no pride, only distance shaped by time and experience. Someone you did not need to recognize until now, he said quietly. The answer did not resolve anything, but it changed the atmosphere completely, because it confirmed that recognition was not accidental, and that whatever history existed behind Daniel Carter was not something casually revealed in public spaces. The cafe remained frozen in that unresolved tension, as if the entire room understood that the moment had already moved beyond a simple incident and into something far more significant, where identity itself had become the central question no one was yet prepared to answer. The cafe remained locked in a suspended silence, the kind that followed a moment too large for anyone present to fully process, while the soft background sounds of cups being placed and distant street noise filtering through the windows felt disconnected from the emotional tension anchored at the center table, where Daniel Carter, Olivia Harrington, and Marcus Blake remained in a silent triangle of uncertainty. Olivia stood slightly apart now, her earlier confidence replaced with measured restraint, as she studied Daniel more carefully than before, as if trying to separate perception from reality, while Marcus maintained his position beside her, his focus no longer on the public incident, but on confirming internal recognition that was slowly becoming harder to dismiss. Daniel remained seated, his posture unchanged, hands resting calmly on the table, eyes steady but distant, as if the unfolding situation required observation rather than participation. Marcus finally spoke again, quieter this time, as if the weight of the information required careful handling. The file I saw was not complete, he said. Olivia immediately turned toward him. What do you mean not complete? Marcus hesitated briefly before continuing. Certain identities were redacted. Certain personnel were never fully documented under public or corporate records. That explanation deepened the tension further, because it suggested that what he remembered was not an ordinary background file, but something intentionally limited in scope. Olivia looked back at Daniel again, her expression shifting from confusion to controlled skepticism. So you are telling me I struck someone who does not even officially exist in full records? She asked. Daniel did not react to the question directly, but his eyes briefly shifted toward Marcus, acknowledging the direction of thought without confirming or denying anything. Marcus continued, now more certain in his tone. The scar is not random. It matches an incident classification marker used in controlled operational environments. That level of marking is not associated with civilian activity. The cafe manager, still lingering near the counter, slowly stepped further back, sensing that the situation had moved far beyond anything related to normal customer interaction, while other patrons quietly lowered their phones, no longer confident about continuing to record. Olivia exhaled slowly, her composure still intact, but now layered with something closer to uncertainty. If that is true, she said, then why would someone like him be living a normal life, raising a child, and sitting in a cafe like this? Marcus did not answer immediately, because that question did not have a simple explanation within his understanding of the data he had recalled. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm and even. Because normal life is not something you lose. It is something you choose when it becomes possible again. The statement did not clarify his past, but it reframed his present in a way that made it harder to reduce him to a single identity. Olivia narrowed her eyes slightly, as if analyzing not just his words, but the intent behind them. You speak like someone who has lived through something you are not willing to describe, she said. Daniel met her gaze briefly. Most people do, he replied. Marcus stepped slightly forward again, his attention fully locked now on Daniel. I need to verify this, he said. Daniel gave a faint nod, not in agreement or resistance, but in acknowledgement that verification was inevitable. Olivia glanced between them both, realizing that the dynamic in front of her had shifted completely from confrontation to investigation, and from authority to uncertainty. The cafe, once filled with everyday noise and routine, now felt like a closed space where something unresolved had been uncovered but not yet fully revealed, leaving everyone present suspended in the quiet tension of a truth that was still forming, but already impossible to ignore. The atmosphere inside the cafe had now shifted into a controlled stillness, where every small movement felt amplified by the weight of what had already been revealed. As Daniel Carter remained seated with steady composure, his hands resting lightly on the table, his expression unchanged but attentive in a way that suggested he was fully aware of every word being exchanged around him. While Olivia Harrington stood slightly back from the table, her posture still composed, yet visibly less certain than before, and Marcus Blake maintained a focused stance beside her, his attention locked not on the incident itself anymore, but on the fragmented memory he was trying to reconstruct from a restricted past briefing. Marcus finally reached for his communication device, pausing for a moment before initiating a secure internal request, his tone low as he spoke into it. I need archival cross-reference on an identifier associated with a facial scar pattern match, he said carefully. Olivia turned toward him immediately. You are escalating this? She asked. Marcus did not look away from the device. I am confirming what I already suspect, he replied. The response caused Olivia to fall silent for a moment, her eyes shifting back to Daniel with a deeper level of scrutiny, as if the situation had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding and into something that required validation from systems beyond personal judgment. Daniel, however, remained calm, his attention now briefly directed toward the window, where normal city life continued outside the cafe, people walking, vehicles passing, unaware of the tension contained within the glass walls. Marcus received a delayed response through his secure channel, and his expression tightened slightly as he read through partial data fragments that matched his memory but did not fully complete it, confirming only that the scar pattern and associated profile belonged to a restricted classification tier with limited public accessibility. Olivia noticed the change in his expression immediately. What does it say? She asked. Marcus hesitated before replying, choosing his words carefully. It confirms the classification level, he said, but not the full identity. That answer created a heavier silence, because it implied intentional restriction rather than absence of information. Olivia slowly turned back to Daniel, her voice quieter now. So you are not even supposed to be traceable in normal systems, she said. Daniel finally met her gaze directly, his expression steady but not defensive. What matters is not what systems record, he said calmly, but what actions remain consistent. Marcus lowered his device slightly, his focus shifting from data to observation again, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the incomplete record he had just accessed. The operational signature tied to that scar, Marcus said, is associated with high-risk field environments that require controlled extraction protocols. Olivia exhaled slowly, her earlier authority now replaced by cautious reassessment, as she processed the implication that the man she had struck in public was potentially connected to environments far removed from anything in her corporate experience. Daniel remained silent for a brief moment, then spoke again in a calm voice. That is no longer my present, he said. The simplicity of the statement did not diminish its weight, because it confirmed distance from whatever past Marcus was trying to reconstruct. The cafe manager, now visibly unsettled, began subtly guiding nearby patrons away from the immediate area, sensing that the situation had become too sensitive for normal public presence. Olivia watched this quietly, then looked back at Marcus. "Are you certain about what you are seeing?" she asked. Marcus did not answer immediately, because certainty was no longer the correct word. Instead, he replied carefully, "I am certain that what I am seeing matches something I was not meant to fully access." That admission changed the tone completely, because it confirmed that even within structured systems, there were limits to understanding Daniel Carter's history. Olivia turned her attention back to Daniel, her expression now no longer accusatory, but uncertain in a different way. "Then why remain hidden?" she asked. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then answered quietly, "Because being known is not always the same as being understood." The statement settled into the space between them, leaving the cafe suspended once again in silence, as if the truth they were approaching had not yet fully revealed itself, but was already impossible to ignore. The cafe had now become almost entirely silent, not from normal closure of activity, but from an unspoken awareness that whatever was unfolding inside could no longer be treated as a public incident. As Daniel Carter remained seated in the same position with steady composure, his hands still resting calmly on the table, while Olivia Harrington stood slightly farther back than before, her expression controlled but visibly unsettled by the accumulation of fragmented confirmations that were beginning to reshape her understanding of the man in front of her. Marcus Blake stood closer to Olivia now, his attention divided between Daniel and the secure data feed on his device, which had just returned another partial classification match, confirming only that the scar pattern and associated profile were linked to a restricted operational category with limited visibility clearance and nothing more. Marcus lowered his device slowly, his voice quieter than before when he spoke. "There is a structural limitation in the record," he said. Olivia turned toward him immediately. "Explain what that means in practical terms," she asked. Marcus paused briefly, choosing precision over speculation. "It means the full identity was intentionally segmented across systems," he replied. The implication of that statement created a subtle shift in Olivia's expression, because segmentation of identity was not something associated with ordinary individuals, but with controlled operational histories that were designed to prevent complete reconstruction from a single access point. Daniel, meanwhile, remained calm, his gaze now directed toward the window again, where the normal flow of city life continued outside without awareness of what was unfolding inside, and that contrast only deepened the sense that he existed in a different layer of experience than the people observing him. Marcus finally stepped closer to the table, lowering his voice further. "The scar pattern is not just an identifier," he said. "It is a procedural marker tied to field classification protocols that require non-public record handling." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are saying he is tied to something that cannot be fully accessed," she said. Marcus nodded once, carefully. "Yes." That single confirmation caused Olivia to fall silent again, her attention returning to Daniel with a more cautious and reassessed focus, no longer driven by authority, but by uncertainty that had no immediate resolution. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone calm and measured. "You are looking for something that does not need to be completed," he said quietly. Marcus frowned slightly. "That is not how verification works," he replied. Daniel met his gaze briefly. "Verification is for systems," he said, "not always for people." The statement created a heavier silence, because it reframed the entire situation from data confirmation to human limitation, and for a moment even Marcus did not respond immediately. Olivia slowly shifted her stance, her earlier certainty now replaced with a controlled but visible reevaluation. "If your identity is fragmented across systems," she said, "then what are we actually seeing?" Daniel looked at her directly for the first time in a longer pause, his expression steady but not defensive. "You are seeing the part that was allowed to remain," he said. Marcus exhaled slowly, lowering his device fully now as if accepting that further access would not produce clarity in this environment. "This level of classification is beyond standard corporate or civilian frameworks," he said quietly. Olivia turned her attention between both men, her voice lower now. So nothing here is complete, she said. Marcus did not disagree. Daniel remained silent for a moment, then spoke calmly. Some things are not meant to be complete in public view, he said. The words settled into the cafe like a final layer of silence, not resolving the tension but deepening its meaning. As Olivia stood in place with a new awareness that the situation she had entered with authority had transformed into something far more complex, where every answer only revealed another boundary, and where the man she had struck was no longer just a stranger, but a fragment of a history none of them could fully access. The cafe had reached a point of complete emotional stillness, where even the smallest sound felt disconnected from the weight of what had already been uncovered. As Daniel Carter remained seated with the same controlled composure he had maintained since the beginning, his presence calm but distant, while Olivia Harrington stood slightly aside, her posture still composed yet no longer anchored in certainty. And Marcus Blake remained closer to the table than before, his focus divided between the fragmented classification data on his device and the man whose identity continued to resist full reconstruction. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, as if acknowledging that every word carried increased significance. The system is not returning a full identity chain, he said. Olivia turned toward him immediately. Then what is it returning? She asked. Marcus hesitated briefly before answering. Only fragments, he said. Operational markers without context continuity. That explanation deepened the silence further, because it confirmed that what he was seeing was not a missing record, but a deliberately incomplete structure. Daniel remained quiet, his gaze now briefly lowered toward the table's surface, as if the discussion itself existed at a distance from him that no longer required participation. Olivia slowly shifted her attention back to him, her voice now quieter but more controlled. If everything about you is fragmented in records, she said, then what are we actually dealing with? Daniel looked up at her calmly. You are dealing with the present moment, he said. Marcus stepped slightly closer, his tone more precise now. Present moment does not erase classification consistency, he said. Daniel turned his attention briefly toward Marcus. Classification is interpretation, he replied, not identity. That statement created another pause, longer than the previous ones, because it separated the idea of recorded data from lived reality in a way that was difficult to challenge directly. Olivia exhaled slowly, her earlier confidence now fully replaced with measured uncertainty. So nothing about you can be fully confirmed here, she said. Marcus nodded once, reluctantly. Not within this environment, he confirmed. Daniel remained still, neither agreeing nor resisting, only allowing the silence to continue. Outside the cafe windows, the city carried on with normal movement, pedestrians walking, vehicles passing, unaware that inside this enclosed space, the concept of identity itself was being reduced into fragments that no system could fully assemble. Marcus finally lowered his device completely, acknowledging the limitation of further retrieval attempts. There are boundaries to access, he said quietly. Olivia looked between Marcus and Daniel, her voice now softer. Then how do you explain what I witnessed earlier? She asked. Daniel responded after a brief pause. You do not explain it, he said. You observe it. The simplicity of the answer created a deeper weight than any detailed explanation could have provided, because it implied that understanding might not come through information, but through experience. Marcus studied Daniel again, his expression now less investigative and more reflective. That level of composure under public pressure is not typical, he said. Daniel replied evenly. Neither is assuming public pressure defines the full scope of a person. The cafe manager, still lingering at a distance, quietly signaled for additional space around the table, sensing that the situation had moved beyond normal interaction into something that required separation rather than interference. Olivia slowly took a step back, her gaze still fixed on Daniel, her authority no longer expressed through control but through observation. Then what happens now? She asked. Daniel looked toward the exit of the cafe for a moment, then back to her. Now nothing changes except understanding, he said calmly. Marcus remained silent, absorbing the implications, while Olivia stood in place, realizing that the encounter she had entered as certainty had dissolved into something far more complex, where every answer only revealed another boundary. and where the man sitting before her could no longer be defined by any single system she had previously trusted. The cafe had settled into a tense equilibrium, where silence was no longer accidental but fully present, shaped by the weight of everything that had been revealed without being fully explained. As Daniel Carter remained seated with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout the entire encounter, his posture calm, his expression neutral, and his attention balanced between presence and detachment. While Olivia Harrington stood a short distance away, her authority no longer expressed through control but through careful reassessment of a reality that had become increasingly difficult to categorize. And Marcus Blake remained closest to the source of uncertainty, his device now lowered completely as he processed the limitations of what he had been able to retrieve. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, as if acknowledging that further certainty might not be available. "The classification structure is not resolving further," he said. Olivia turned toward him immediately. "Meaning what exactly?" she asked. Marcus hesitated for a brief moment before answering. "Meaning there are intentional gaps," he said. "Not missing data, but restricted continuity blocks." That statement deepened the silence again, because it confirmed that what they were observing was not accidental absence, but controlled separation of information, a structure designed to prevent complete understanding through standard verification methods. Daniel remained still, his gaze now directed toward the table, as if the conversation itself existed slightly outside of his immediate concern, while still fully acknowledged. Olivia slowly shifted her stance, her voice now softer but more deliberate. "If everything about you exists in fragments," she said, "then what part of you are we actually interacting with right now?" Daniel looked up calmly. "The part that is required for this moment," he said. Marcus exhaled quietly, as if the answer aligned with what he had already begun to suspect, but could not fully articulate. "That level of controlled presence is consistent with structured operational conditioning," he said. Daniel turned his attention briefly toward Marcus. "Or it is simply experience," he replied. The distinction lingered, because it removed the assumption that extraordinary systems were necessary to explain behavior that could also be the result of long-term adaptation. Olivia studied Daniel again, her expression now less certain than before. "You keep separating identity from systems," she said. "But systems are how identity is usually verified." Daniel responded evenly. "Systems are how identity is recorded, not always how it is lived." That statement caused another pause, longer than the previous ones, as Marcus looked between them both, recognizing that the conversation had shifted from investigation into philosophical limitation. The cafe manager quietly signaled to maintain distance around the table, sensing that external presence was no longer appropriate for the nature of discussion taking place. Olivia took a slow breath, her earlier confidence now replaced with structured uncertainty. "Then how do we move forward from this?" she asked. Daniel looked briefly toward the exit again, then back to her. "You do not move forward from understanding someone partially," he said. "You accept that full understanding may not be required." Marcus lowered his head slightly, processing the implications of that statement, while Olivia remained still, absorbing the idea that clarity might not be achievable through confirmation alone. Outside the cafe, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaffected by the internal shift that had occurred within these walls. But inside, the dynamic between three people had fundamentally changed, as Olivia Harrington no longer stood as an unquestioned authority. Marcus Blake no longer functioned purely as a verifier of truth, and Daniel Carter remained an unresolved presence that neither system nor assumption could fully define, leaving the moment suspended in a quiet state of incomplete recognition. The cafe remained in a suspended silence that felt heavier than before, not because anything new had been spoken, but because everything that could be confirmed had already reached its limit, leaving only interpretation and uncertainty behind. As Daniel Carter continued to sit with steady composure, his posture unchanged, his expression calm and unreadable, while Olivia Harrington stood a short distance away, no longer holding the same certainty that had defined her presence at the beginning of this encounter. And Marcus Blake remained closest to the center of unresolved truth, his attention no longer focused on extracting more data, but on reconciling what he had already seen with what he was unable to complete. Marcus finally lowered his device fully, and spoke in a quieter tone than before. "There will be no further resolution through this channel," he said. Olivia turned slightly toward him. "Meaning you are done investigating?" she asked. Marcus paused briefly before answering. "Meaning the system is not designed to complete this profile in a public environment," he said. That statement settled into the space between them, confirming that the limitations were structural rather than incidental, and that what they were dealing with was not a lack of information, but a controlled boundary of understanding. Daniel remained still for a moment longer, then slowly adjusted his posture, as if preparing to leave without urgency or announcement, his movements calm and deliberate, reflecting no emotional shift from the intensity of the discussion that had taken place around him. Olivia watched him closely now, her voice lower and more measured than before. "If you are willing to walk away from this without explanation," she said, "then what was the purpose of any of it?" Daniel paused briefly, then responded in a calm and even tone. "There is no purpose in forcing completeness where it is not required," he said. Marcus stepped back slightly, no longer treating the situation as an active investigation, but as a closed system with unresolved variables. "Everything I have accessed suggests controlled fragmentation of identity records," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. Olivia exhaled slowly, her earlier authority now fully replaced by a more reflective uncertainty. "So I struck someone in public who cannot even be fully defined through any normal means," she said, almost as a realization rather than a question. Daniel looked at her briefly, his expression steady but not distant. "You reacted to what you believed you saw," he said. "That does not change what I am." The simplicity of that statement created a final shift in the atmosphere, because it removed judgment from the equation entirely, leaving only perception and consequence. Marcus remained silent for several seconds, then finally spoke. "Whatever your history is," he said carefully, "it is not something that can be reconstructed here." Daniel gave a faint nod, acknowledging the limitation without resistance. Olivia looked at him for a long moment, her expression no longer defensive or authoritative, but quietly reflective. "Then what remains after all of this?" she asked. Daniel turned his gaze briefly toward the exit of the cafe, where normal life continued outside without interruption or awareness of what had unfolded within. "What remains is what you choose to understand moving forward," he said. The answer did not resolve the mystery, but it closed the interaction in a way that shifted responsibility away from explanation and toward perception. Marcus stepped slightly aside, no longer obstructing space, as if accepting that further pursuit of clarity would not produce additional resolution in this environment. Olivia remained still, processing the absence of closure more than the presence of information, while Daniel finally stood from his seat with calm precision, adjusting his jacket and preparing to leave without further acknowledgement. No one stopped him, because at that point it was clear that stopping him would not bring answers, and following him would not produce completeness, leaving only the quiet realization that what had occurred in this cafe was not a confrontation that ended in resolution, but an encounter that ended in recognition of limits, where identity remained partially visible, but never fully defined. Thank you for watching this video until the end. We truly appreciate your time and support. Please share your thoughts and feelings about this story in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and powerful stories like this. Stay safe, stay inspired, and we will see you in the next video.